At midnight, Boaz woke with a start. The harvest lay gathered around him on the threshing floor, and a woman was at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am Ruth, your servant," she answered. Then she made the request that had brought her there. "Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer." The words carried the weight of a dead household. Ruth was a widow, a foreigner from Moab, and a woman without property or standing of her own in Bethlehem. Boaz belonged to the family of her late husband. He had the power to protect, but another relative possessed a stronger claim. Ruth's appeal could not be settled in the darkness. It touched inheritance, marriage, family duty, and the survival of a name that was in danger of disappearing from Israel. By the next day, the matter would move from the threshing floor to the town gate. Elders would be summoned, land would be discussed, a man would be asked to choose between acquiring an inheritance and assuming its obligations. Ruth's future would depend on decisions made within laws and customs older than any of the people standing there. Yet the woman asking for redemption had once entered Bethlehem with nothing. She had arrived beside another widow at the beginning of harvest, dependent on whatever grain the reapers left behind. She belonged to a people often viewed with suspicion in Judah. No one looking at her first journey could have seen the royal line ahead of her. The road to that threshing floor began years earlier, during one of the most unsettled periods in Israel's history. The judges governed Israel before the rise of the monarchy, when the tribes had no permanent king, and authority was scattered among households, clans, elders, priests, and local leaders. The Book of Judges remembers the period as a recurring sequence of disorder, oppression, deliverance, and relapse. Israel's enemies changed, and so did the judges raised to confront them. Some crises affected broad regions, others were local. Daily life continued beneath that instability. Families planted fields, harvested grain, arranged marriages, raised children, and depended on the strength of their communities. Ruth's account opens away from battlefields and public assemblies. Its first crisis is hunger. There was a famine in the land. For an agricultural household, famine was more than a season of expensive food. Grain supplied the ordinary structure of life. Barley and wheat became bread. Seed had to be preserved for the next sowing, even while present hunger pressed against every stored measure. Livestock depended on what the land could support. A failed harvest could therefore threaten the future twice. First by reducing the food available now, then by consuming the reserves needed to begin again. The famine reached Bethlehem in Judah. The town's name was associated with a house of bread, but a meaningful name could not fill empty storage jars. Bethlehem stood in the hill country south of Jerusalem, surrounded by land where grain, vines, and olive trees could be cultivated when rainfall and labor allowed. Its households were tied to those fields. Their property, ancestry, and place in the community were connected. One man from Bethlehem decided to leave. His name was Elimelech. His wife was Naomi, and their two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. The family were identified as Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, a description that firmly located them within the people and territory they were about to leave. Their movement was therefore no casual journey. They had a home, a town, and an ancestral identity in Judah. Famine made remaining there dangerous enough that life outside the land appeared preferable. Their destination was Moab. From Judah, Moab lay east of the Dead Sea, across the Great Depression of the Jordan Valley, and up onto the plateau beyond. The territory was close enough to be a practical refuge and foreign enough to alter the family's status. Its elevated tableland included areas suitable for grain and pasture. Rain could fail in one region while conditions elsewhere remained sufficient, making migration a familiar response to severe local shortage in the ancient world. But moving did not erase vulnerability. It exchanged one kind for another. In Bethlehem, Elimelech's household belonged to a recognized lineage. Relatives, inherited land, and communal obligations connected them to the town. In Moab, they would live as newcomers. Their survival might improve if food was available, but they would be outside the network that had defined their place. Ancient households relied heavily on those networks. There were no public systems capable of replacing family land, kinship protection, and stored harvests when disaster struck. To leave one's people was to loosen the bonds that ordinarily carried a family through illness, death, debt, and dispute. Elimelech did not travel alone. Naomi and both sons went with him. The entire immediate household crossed out of Judah together. That detail gives the departure its seriousness. This was not one member going ahead to trade or search for temporary work, while the family remained securely at home. The household itself moved. Whatever could be carried went with them. Whatever could not be carried was left under the shadow of famine. Their common future was now concentrated in 4 people. Elimelech stood at the head of that household. Naomi was its wife and mother. Mahlon and Chilion represented its next generation. In a world where land normally passed through family lines, the sons mattered to the continuity of Elimelech's name and property. If the family survived abroad and eventually returned, its place in Bethlehem might continue through them. That possibility was still intact when they set out. The language of the account presents their initial intention as a sojourn in Moab. They went to reside there as foreigners. A sojourner lived outside his native community, often for economic necessity, while remaining distinct from the people among whom he settled. The word fits a family driven by famine. Moab was a refuge from conditions in Judah, not yet a replacement for their identity as people of Bethlehem. For Naomi, the journey carried an additional cost. The land she left contained the household relationships that gave her an acknowledged place. Her future was joined to Elimelech's choices and to the lives of her sons. As long as all 4 remained together, the family still possessed its internal structure. They were displaced, but they were not yet broken. The account does not pause over the road itself. Its attention rests on the decision and its consequences. Still, the geography helps explain the scale of the move. Bethlehem occupied the western highlands. Moab rose beyond the Dead Sea to the east. Travel between them meant leaving familiar hills, descending toward the lowest region of the landscape, crossing into territory associated with another people, and climbing again. This was a relocation across both terrain and identity. Moab and Israel were neighbors, and proximity did not make them interchangeable. Each people understood itself through its own land, ancestry, worship, and social bonds. A Judean family arriving in Moab would remain visibly connected to Judah. Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion carried Bethlehem with them in their names, speech, memory, and family origin, even as they sought sustenance elsewhere. The title Moabite would later cling to Ruth each time her foreign origin mattered in Bethlehem. At this point, however, Ruth had not yet entered the household. The family arriving from Judah consisted only of Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons. Ruth belonged to the land toward which they were moving, unaware of the place she would eventually occupy in the destiny of these immigrants. That is one of the story's defining reversals. The family entered Moab, hoping the foreign land would preserve what Bethlehem could not sustain. Years later, a woman from that foreign land would become the person who carried their threatened household back toward a future. Nothing in the departure looked like the beginning of a royal genealogy. It looked like a family responding to crop failure. Famine narrows decisions. Land that embodies inheritance can become land that will not feed its inheritors. A home that establishes belonging can become the place from which survival requires absence. Elimelech's household faced that pressure before any of its members could know where the decision would lead. Their move also established the tension that would govern everything after it. The family's land and ancestry remained in Bethlehem, while the people who bore that ancestry now lived in Moab. Their property could not travel with them. Their connection to it might endure, but only if the household itself endured. This is why family continuity would become inseparable from questions of land. In Israel's village world, an inheritance was not simply an asset that could be detached from the people who had held it. It located a household among its kin and preserved a share in the community across generations. A family might lose the use of land through poverty or absence. Restoring it could require the intervention of a relative. But land returned without an heir could still leave a family name at an end. Those problems remained far ahead. At the beginning, there was only famine and the choice to seek relief. Elimelech led his wife and sons away from Bethlehem. Naomi left the women and households among whom she had lived. Mahlon and Chilion left the town to which their father's family belonged. Together, they entered Moab as a single household, carrying the hope that a foreign field might offer what Judah's fields had withheld. They reached the country of Moab and remained there. The immediate movement had succeeded. The family had escaped the famine's center and found a place to reside. All four had arrived. Elimelech was still head of the household. Naomi still had her husband and sons. Mahlon and Chilion still held the possibility of extending the family into another generation. They had crossed the border with their household intact. That would not last. Elimelech died. The family's first great loss in Moab removed the man whose decision had brought them there, and whose household held their connection to Bethlehem. Naomi was now a widow in a foreign country. The refuge that had seemed capable of preserving the family had become the place where its head was buried. His death changed every relationship within the household. Naomi remained a mother, but she no longer had a husband beside her. Mahlon and Chilion remained sons, but their father could no longer guide the family's affairs or represent its interests. The next generation now carried the household's immediate future. Naomi was left with her two sons. That brief statement marks both loss and remaining hope. Widowhood exposed a woman to serious economic and social danger, especially away from her own kin. But Naomi was not yet alone. Her sons could work, marry, and build households. Through them, Elimelech's line could continue. Their presence also gave Naomi a place within a family that still had a future tense. The sons took Moabite wives. Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. These marriages joined the Judean immigrants to women of the country where they had settled. Ruth and Orpah entered the family as wives and became Naomi's daughters-in-law. The connection was no temporary arrangement. Marriage created obligations between households and established a new generation's closest bonds. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah would later speak to one another as women whose lives had been genuinely joined by those unions. The women's Moabite identity matters because the family's movement had now become deeper than residence. Elimelech had crossed into Moab, seeking relief from famine. His sons formed marriages there. A stay that began as a response to emergency had produced relationships capable of rooting the next generation outside Judah. Ruth and Orpah also entered a household with a memory elsewhere. Their husbands belonged to Bethlehem. Their mother-in-law had come from Judah. The family's inherited place lay across the Dead Sea, in a town the two women had not called home. Marriage connected them to that distant place before either faced a decision about whether to go there. For the moment, their lives remained in Moab. The family stayed there for about 10 years. A decade gives displacement time to become ordinary. The famine that prompted the journey belonged to an earlier moment, while life in Moab accumulated its own routines and relationships. Mahlon and Chilion were no longer simply the sons who had arrived with their parents. They were married men. Ruth and Orpah were no longer women outside the immigrant household. They were part of it. Naomi's position had also changed. When she left Bethlehem, she had traveled as Elimelech's wife with 2 sons. After his death, she lived as the widowed mother of 2 married households. Her security was bound to Mahlon and Chilion, and the continuity of the family depended on them. Children would have extended that continuity. A son born to either marriage could have carried the household into another generation and provided Naomi with a grandson linked to Elimelech's line. A daughter would also have enlarged the family and created new relationships. But when the decisive losses came, neither marriage had produced a child who remained to inherit the family's future. The absence of children would soon make every death heavier. There was no next generation waiting behind Mahlon and Chilion. If both men were removed, Elimelech's household would have no direct male descendant in Moab and no obvious heir to reconnect its name with its property in Bethlehem. Then Mahlon and Chilion died. The account places the deaths together, allowing them to fall with almost a single blow. Naomi had already buried her husband. Now both sons were gone as well. The 2 men who had survived the migration, married in Moab, and carried the family's hope into the next generation, disappeared before that hope could pass to children. Elimelech's household had lost its head, and both heirs. The move undertaken to escape death by famine had ended with all 3 men dead in the land of refuge. Naomi was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. That order of loss matters. Elimelech's death had made her a widow, but Mahlon and Chilion had remained. Their deaths removed the relationships through which her household could most naturally continue. She had begun the decade as a wife and mother in a family of 4. She now stood at the end of it as the surviving member of that original household. Ruth and Orpah had also become widows. Each had lost the husband through whom she was connected to Naomi. Neither had a child from the marriage to preserve that bond in the form of a son or daughter. By ordinary expectation, the deaths of Mahlon and Chilion might have dissolved the household into separate parts, Naomi belonging by origin to Judah, Ruth and Orpah belonging by origin to Moab. Yet the 3 women remained connected by what had happened among them. Naomi did not cease to call Ruth and Orpah her daughters-in-law. They did not immediately treat her as a former relative whose claim had ended with their husbands. The marriages had joined their lives, and death now forced them to determine what those bonds required when the men at their center were gone. Their losses were shared, but their positions were different. Ruth and Orpah were Moabite widows living among their own people. Their mothers' households and wider family connections belonged to the country around them. They could potentially return to those networks and, if opportunity arose, marry again. Their lives had been altered by marriage to Judean men, but Moab remained their native land. Naomi was a Judean widow living away from hers. Her husband and sons had provided her immediate family in Moab, and all 3 were dead. The country that surrounded Ruth and Orpah with familiar identity surrounded Naomi as a foreigner. Her ancestral community was in Bethlehem, but a decade and several graves now stood between the woman who had left and any return. The deaths also transformed the meaning of the family's property in Judah. While Mahlon and Chilion lived, the connection between Elimelech's household and Bethlehem could pass through them. They might someday return, claim what belonged to the family, or establish descendants whose inheritance reached back to their father. With both sons dead and childless, that path had closed. Naomi could still possess an interest in what the family had left behind, but possession alone could not restore the dead. Land might be recovered, sold, or transferred under the customs that protected family holdings. The more difficult problem was the household's name. an inherited field, could continue to be called Elimelech's, yet without descendants his line would vanish from the generations that followed. This is the pressure that will eventually bring kinship and redemption into the story. A close relative could sometimes act to preserve property within a family or rescue a household from economic collapse. Such a man served as a redeemer because his nearness created responsibility. But no redeemer had yet stepped forward, and the women were still in Moab, far from the relatives whose standing came through Elimelech. At this stage, the crisis was immediate rather than legal. 3 women had lost the men upon whom their household's economic structure had depended. They had no harvest of their own, no children to succeed the dead, and no single future that served them equally. Widowhood in the ancient world did not make survival impossible, but it removed many of the protections society normally organized through men and households. Access to land, labor, legal representation, and inheritance usually flowed through family relationships. A widow with adult sons could find security through them. A younger widow might return to her father's household or marry again. A widow, separated from both her birth family and her husband's relatives, faced narrower choices. Naomi's losses combined these dangers. Her birth community lay in Judah. Her husband's family connections were there as well. In Moab, the people closest to her were 2 women whose legal and social options pointed back toward their own families. Ruth and Orpah faced a different uncertainty. Remaining with Naomi might express loyalty, but Naomi no longer had sons for them to marry, property in Moab to support them, or a husband who could maintain a household. Following her anywhere would mean tying their futures to a widow whose material resources had collapsed. The family's earlier shape had concealed those divisions. Elimelech's presence had joined wife and sons under one head. The sons' marriages had then brought Ruth and Orpah into the household. Once all 3 men were dead, each woman's surviving ties pulled in a different direction. Naomi's history pulled toward Bethlehem. Ruth and Orpah's origins pulled toward their mothers' homes in Moab. Their marriages pulled them toward Naomi and toward the memory of Mahlon and Chilion. Their need for food and security pressed against every claim of loyalty. No decision had yet been made. Before the women could choose a road, they had to confront what remained of the household. Elimelech was dead. Mahlon was dead. Chilion was dead. No child stood behind them. The family that had left Bethlehem to preserve its life had been reduced to 3 widows in Moab. Naomi had once departed with a husband and 2 sons. She was now bereft of all 3, living in the country that had received them but could no longer give Elimelech's household a future through its men. Then, into that closed world of loss, word came from Judah. Naomi heard that the Lord had attended to his people and given them food. The report changed the direction of the story. Bethlehem, once unable to sustain Elimelech's household, had grain again. The famine that had driven the family into Moab no longer barred Naomi's return. The wording of the news placed the renewed harvest under God's care. The Lord had visited his people. He had turned his attention toward them in action, and the result was bread. For Naomi, this was not distant information about improved conditions in Judah. Food had returned to the place where her family still had roots. She rose to leave Moab. Naomi's decision answered her most urgent need. She had no husband or sons maintaining a household where she was. In Bethlehem, she could at least return among her own people, near the family connections and property associated with Elimelech. The town could not give back the men she had lost, but it offered a place where her identity was known and where a harvest was underway. Ruth and Orpah went with her. At first, the 3 widows moved as one company. Naomi left the place where she had lived in Moab, and her daughters-in-law left with her. Their presence showed that the bonds created by marriage had survived the deaths of Mahlon and Chilion. Neither woman simply watched Naomi depart. They set out on the road leading back to Judah. For Naomi, the journey was a return. Every mile carried her toward a place she had known before the famine, even though she would arrive under circumstances radically altered from those in which she had left. For Ruth and Orpah, the same road led away from home. Judah was their husband's country, but it was not theirs. What Naomi was recovering, they would be surrendering. That difference grew more serious as they traveled. Naomi could not treat their companionship as a small kindness. If they continued with her, Ruth and Orpah would leave the households into which they had been born. They would cross into a land where their Moabite origin distinguished them, attach themselves to an impoverished widow, and reduce their prospects of finding stable homes of their own. Naomi therefore turned to them and said, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house." The command cut across the direction of their feet. They had begun by accompanying her toward Judah. Naomi now told them to reverse course. Her choice of the mother's house pointed toward the sphere in which the two younger women could be received, sheltered, and prepared for a different future. Returning did not mean wandering back into Moab alone. It meant re-entering the family networks they had known before marriage. That option was available because Ruth and Orpah were still among their own people. Naomi was giving them permission to let the deaths of their husbands end their obligation to her. She would not use affection, grief, or family duty to draw them into her uncertain return. Then Naomi blessed them. "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Her words reveal what Ruth and Orpah had already done. They had shown kindness to Mahlon and Chilion while the men lived, and their loyalty had not ended at the graves. They had also dealt kindly with Naomi. Their presence on the road was part of that record. The kindness Naomi named was more than politeness. It was the faithful action that preserves a relationship when circumstances make abandonment easier. Ruth and Orpah had married into Naomi's household. When death removed their husbands, they continued to act as daughters-in-law. Naomi recognized that loyalty even while releasing them from any expectation of extending it further. She asked the God of Israel to repay them in Moab. That blessing is striking within the movement of the scene. Naomi was returning because she had heard that the Lord had given food to his people in Judah. Yet she did not speak as though his kindness could reach Ruth and Orpah only if they followed her there. She entrusted the two Moabite women to the Lord while urging them to remain in their native land. Naomi then made her hope for them specific. "May the Lord grant that each of you find rest in the house of another husband." Rest meant more than relief from travel or grief. Naomi wanted each woman to receive the settled security of a household, a husband, a recognized place, provision, and the possibility of children. Widowhood had disrupted that stability. Remarriage could restore it. Naomi's own household could offer no such rest. She was leaving Moab without a husband, without sons maintaining her, and without visible means of supporting two additional widows. Bethlehem had food again, but that did not mean Naomi possessed food. A town's restored harvest did not automatically become the property of every person who entered its gates. By telling Ruth and Orpah to return, Naomi separated what comforted her from what she believed might benefit them. Their companionship would have eased her journey and softened her arrival. She chose instead to send them toward the stronger prospect of security. The blessing also acknowledged that a new marriage would not erase the old one. Ruth and Orpah had shown kindness to their dead husbands. Naomi did not ask them to preserve that loyalty by remaining permanently attached to loss. She asked that their faithfulness be answered with a future. After speaking, Naomi kissed them. The kiss gave the words the character of farewell. This was no discussion about temporary travel arrangements. Naomi intended to part from them on the road and continue toward Judah alone. All three women lifted their voices and wept. Their grief now included a second separation. Ruth and Orpah had lost their husbands. Naomi had lost her sons. If the younger women obeyed her, the household formed in Moab would finally dissolve. Naomi would return to Bethlehem, carrying its memories by herself, while Ruth and Orpah returned to families who had known them before Mahlon and Chilion. The tears show why Naomi's command was difficult without deciding the issue for them. Affection pulled the women together. Practical security pulled them apart. Both forces were real. Naomi's argument had placed their interests first. She did not promise that Bethlehem would welcome them, that relatives would provide for them, or that marriage awaited them in Judah. The future she desired for Ruth and Orpah was more reasonably sought in the houses of their own people. The younger women, however, did not accept the farewell. "No," they said, "we will return with you to your people." Their answer treated Naomi's destination as a journey they were prepared to share. They did not say only that they would accompany her farther along the road or make certain she crossed safely. They spoke of going with her to her people. That decision would require more than affection for Naomi. It would carry them out of the social world in which Naomi had just told them to seek rest. Their mothers' houses lay behind them. The people of Judah lay ahead. To continue was to choose a widowed mother-in-law over the households of their birth. At this point, Ruth and Orpah answered together. Nothing yet separated the two women. Both had married sons of the same immigrant family. Both had been widowed without children. Both had shown kindness to Naomi. Both had begun the road to Judah, wept at the proposed farewell, and refused the first command to return. Their unity made Naomi's dilemma sharper. Sending away one would be painful. Sending away both meant accepting complete solitude. Taking them with her, however, would allow their loyalty to bind them to her poverty. Naomi's blessing had already given them freedom to go. Their first answer gave that freedom back. They were willing to remain daughters to a woman who could offer them no husbands and no secure household. The word return now held different meanings in the mouths of the three widows. Naomi used it to direct Ruth and Orpah back to their Moabite families. They used it to describe traveling with Naomi toward Judah. For Naomi, Bethlehem was home. For the younger women, going there could only be a return through their dead husband's connection to that place. Their declaration was sincere, but it had not yet survived the full cost of the choice. Naomi had spoken of the future she wanted for them. She had not yet forced them to examine whether any future with her was possible. The first farewell had appealed to love, the love of mothers, homes, dead husbands, and the widow standing before them. Ruth and Orpah answered from that same field of loyalty. Naomi would now make the question harder. She would ask them to look beyond the road, beyond the tears, and beyond their desire to remain together. She would make them face the years ahead. For the moment they stood united in refusal. "We will return with you to your people." Naomi answered by removing every hope they might still have attached to her. "Return, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Do I still have sons in my womb who could become your husbands?" Her question drew upon the family structure that death had destroyed. Ruth and Orpah had entered Naomi's household by marrying her sons. If another son existed, family custom might have provided a way for one of the widows to remain connected to the dead man's line. But Naomi had no surviving son. There was no brother who could assume responsibility for either widow, and no child waiting to grow into that role. Naomi pushed the argument further. "Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband." Then she constructed the most hopeful possibility, only to show how impossible it was. Even if she could say that she still had hope, even if she married that very night, even if she then bore sons, would Ruth and Orpah wait until those sons grew up? Would they refuse other marriages for years in expectation of husbands from Naomi? The answer was built into the questions. Such a future could not provide the rest Naomi had asked God to give them. Her reasoning treated time as part of their danger. Ruth and Orpah were young enough for remarriage to remain a realistic possibility. Waiting for imaginary sons would consume the years in which they might establish households elsewhere. Loyalty to Naomi could become a decision to remain widows without any promise that their sacrifice would preserve the family. Naomi refused to let them follow her under that illusion. "No, my daughters," she said, "it is far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." She was not denying their grief. Ruth and Orpah had lost their husbands. Naomi understood their loss from the other side. She had lost the same two men as sons after already losing their father. What distinguished her bitterness was the collapse of every path she could see. The younger women could return to their people and seek new homes. Naomi believed she was returning with the weight of God's hand against her. That conviction gave her argument a darker edge. If her life had come under divine affliction, why should Ruth and Orpah attach their futures to hers? Naomi could bless them in the name of the Lord, but she could not describe herself as a source of blessing. From her perspective, separating from her offered them the better chance of receiving the kindness she had requested for them. The three women lifted their voices and wept again. The first tears had followed Naomi's blessing and farewell. These followed her dismantling of their shared future. The issue was no longer whether they loved one another. It was whether love required the same choice from each of them. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. This time, the kiss completed the farewell. Orpah accepted Naomi's release and turned back. She chose the mother's house, the people, and the possibility of another husband that Naomi had placed before her. Her departure was not betrayal. Naomi had urged it twice and supported the command with a blessing. Orpah took the course that ordinary prudence and family expectation recommended. She had accompanied Naomi onto the road, resisted the first separation, and wept when the argument became final. Then she obeyed. Orpah's choice matters because it shows the full legitimacy of the path Ruth refused. Returning to Moab was available. Naomi desired it for both women. One of them now demonstrated that the road back could be taken. Ruth remained. The account describes her action with one forceful word. She clung to Naomi. This was more than standing still after Orpah left. Clinging expressed a bond held firmly when separation pressed against it. The same deaths that had legally loosened Ruth from Naomi became the setting in which Ruth attached herself more closely. Naomi pointed to Orpah. "Look, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to her gods. Go back after your sister-in-law." Now the separation was visible. Orpah was no longer only an example Naomi could imagine. She was already returning toward Moab. Ruth could follow her. The two widows shared the same origin and the same loss, and the way back remained open to both. Naomi named everything Ruth would recover by turning around. Orpah was returning to her people, the community in which she belonged by birth. She was also returning to the gods associated with that people. The decision concerned worship and identity as well as geography and family. Ruth answered Naomi with words that closed the road behind her. "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you." Naomi had commanded her to return and then supported the command with practical reasoning. Ruth did not answer each point. She did not claim that Naomi could provide a husband, guarantee food, or make life in Judah secure. Her decision accepted the absence of those assurances. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." Ruth joined her movement to Naomi's movement and her dwelling to Naomi's dwelling. She was not offering assistance only for the remainder of the journey. Wherever Naomi established herself, Ruth would share that place. Then she crossed the deeper boundary. "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Orpah had returned to her people and her gods. Ruth declared that Naomi's people and Naomi's God would now define her own allegiance. Judah would no longer be merely the homeland of her dead husband. She was binding herself to Israel through Naomi. This commitment did not depend on Israel first receiving her. Ruth spoke before reaching Bethlehem, before meeting Naomi's relatives, and before knowing how the town would respond to a Moabite widow. She chose Naomi's people without a promise of acceptance from them. She chose the Lord with the same finality. Naomi had just described his hand as having gone out against her. Ruth did not wait for Naomi's circumstances to improve before identifying herself with Naomi's God. She entered that allegiance at the point where Naomi herself felt afflicted. Ruth continued, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." The pledge extended beyond shared travel, shared residence, or even Naomi's remaining years. Ruth accepted death in the land to which they were going and burial there afterward. Burial joined a person to a place and to the community that remembered its dead. By choosing burial with Naomi, Ruth surrendered the expectation that her body would eventually be returned to Moab. She finished by invoking the Lord against herself. May he deal with her severely, if anything but death separated her from Naomi. This was an oath, not an expression of passing devotion. Ruth called upon Israel's God to enforce the promise she had made. Her commitment now carried sacred accountability. Naomi had tried to release her from obligation. Ruth freely created a new one. Even death was named carefully. Ruth did not promise that death itself would erase the bond. She had already chosen to die and be buried where Naomi died. Only death could interrupt their living companionship, and burial would preserve their association with the same land. The pledge transformed Ruth's position. Until this moment, she had been Naomi's Moabite daughter-in-law because she had married Mahlon. That marriage had ended with Mahlon's death. Ruth now bound herself to Naomi by her own decision. Her loyalty no longer depended on the living presence of the man who had first joined them. She also accepted obligations that ran in only one direction. Naomi could not make an equivalent pledge to go wherever Ruth went, because Naomi was returning to Bethlehem. Ruth was the one changing peoples, land, and religious allegiance. She carried the cost of the promise. Nothing in her words demanded compensation. Ruth did not ask Naomi to guarantee protection or arrange a future in exchange for her loyalty. She answered Naomi's insistence that there was no husband to offer and no son to await by committing herself anyway. That choice distinguished Ruth from Orpah without condemning Orpah. Orpah followed the reasonable course Naomi urged. Ruth chose a faithfulness beyond what Naomi expected or could repay. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. The debate ended because Ruth's resolve had become unmistakable. Naomi had appealed to family duty, remarriage, time, survival, and the example of Orpah. Ruth's oath had absorbed every cost those arguments exposed. There was nothing left to clarify. Two women now continued where three had begun. Orpah went back toward the life Naomi had blessed her to seek. Ruth went forward beside a woman who believed she was returning under divine bitterness. The road divided their futures with no accusation and no spectacle. One kiss marked release, one act of clinging established a bond that would redirect generations. Naomi was still the person who knew Bethlehem. She knew the town, the people, and the household from which she had come. Ruth brought no comparable knowledge. Her security rested in the promise she had just made, and in the companionship of a widow who had repeatedly told her she possessed nothing to give. Yet Ruth was no longer being carried toward Judah by the memory of her husband alone. She had named her own destination. Naomi's people would be her people. Naomi's God would be her God. Naomi's place of death would be hers. The two widows traveled on together. Ahead lay Bethlehem, the town Naomi had left with a husband and two sons. She was approaching it with neither. Beside her walked the one person she had tried hardest to send away, a Moabite woman who had chosen exile from her own country rather than abandon her. They continued toward Judah until the road brought them to Bethlehem. When they entered the town, Bethlehem stirred because of them. The arrival did not pass quietly. Naomi had left as a member of a known Ephrathite household. Now, after years in Moab, she reappeared without Elimelech, Mahlon, or Chilion, and with a Moabite woman beside her. The return was personal news in a community where family identity and public memory were closely joined. The women of Bethlehem asked, "Is this Naomi?" Their question carried recognition and astonishment together. The woman before them was the same Naomi who had once lived among them, but the household in which they had known her was gone. She had departed during famine with a husband and 2 sons. Her return made their absence visible. Naomi answered the town by rejecting the name with which it greeted her. "Do not call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Naomi's name was associated with pleasantness. Mara meant bitter. She was asking the women to name her according to what her life had become. This was more than a description of sorrow. In the world of Ruth, names could carry identity, memory, and expectation. Naomi believed that the old name no longer matched the evidence standing before Bethlehem. The woman who had left and the woman who returned were connected by memory, but loss had changed the way she understood herself. She explained the contrast. "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." The famine had driven her family from Bethlehem, yet Naomi now described that departure as fullness. She was not speaking about grain. She had left with Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. The household had possessed the relationships that mattered most to its continuation. Moab had taken those relationships from her one by one. Bethlehem saw only 2 women entering the town, but Naomi measured the return against the 4 people who had departed. By that measure, she was empty. Ruth stood beside her as she said it. Naomi's words did not erase Ruth's loyalty. They revealed the depth of the losses Ruth's presence had not yet repaired. Ruth was a devoted daughter-in-law, but she was not Naomi's husband, either of Naomi's sons, or a child capable of carrying their line forward. At the moment of arrival, Naomi could see no way for Ruth's companionship to reverse what death had done. There was also a difference between relationship and provision. Ruth had come with her, but both women were widows. Neither arrived leading a household with land under cultivation, stored grain, or men responsible for supporting them. Ruth prevented Naomi's solitude. She did not remove their poverty. Naomi continued, "Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" She placed her suffering inside her understanding of God's rule. The same Lord whose care had restored bread to Bethlehem had, in Naomi's judgment, acted against her. She did not attribute the deaths to chance or speak as though God had been absent. She believed his hand stood behind the bitter shape of her life. Her words were spoken publicly among women who remembered her former household. Naomi was giving testimony about the distance between departure and return. She did not ask Bethlehem to admire her survival. She asked the town to recognize her affliction. The name Almighty suited the force of what she described. Naomi had been unable to protect her husband or sons, unable to produce the future once expected through them, and unable to resist the losses that followed her into widowhood. The power governing her circumstances appeared to her as power exercised in judgment. Yet her own sentence contained a movement she could not deny. The Lord had brought her back. Naomi had heard about food, risen and traveled from Moab, but she understood the completed return as something God had done. The God she accused of bringing her home empty was also the one who had brought her home at all. That tension remained unresolved. Bethlehem had bread again, but Naomi did not yet possess a share of it. She had reached her people, but she did not yet know what help they would provide. She had returned to the place associated with her husband's family, but the men through whom that family continued were dead. The town's first response was agitation, not resolution. Bethlehem recognized Naomi and heard her account. Recognition gave her a social place that a stranger would not have possessed, but recognition alone could not restore her household. The women could call her by name. Naomi insisted that the name itself had been emptied of its old meaning. Ruth's position was even less secure. Naomi returned. Ruth arrived. The narrator identifies her again as Ruth the Moabite, Naomi's daughter-in-law, the woman who came back with her from the country of Moab. Her loyalty had made Naomi's journey possible as a shared journey, but it had not made Ruth a native of Bethlehem. The town could connect Naomi to a remembered past. Ruth was known through her foreign origin and through her relationship to Naomi. That relationship was genuine but complicated. Ruth had been the wife of a Bethlehemite living in Moab. She now entered his ancestral town after his death, attached to his mother, but without him beside her. She belonged to Naomi's household through marriage and oath, yet the household itself had no active head. The label Moabite would accompany Ruth through the early stages of her life in Judah because it shaped how others encountered her. Her speech on the road had declared Naomi's people to be her people, but a private commitment did not instantly alter public identity. Bethlehem first saw a woman from Moab. The town also saw a widow. Ruth's need was therefore visible in several ways at once. She was a newcomer, a foreigner, and a woman without a husband. She had chosen to share Naomi's future, and Naomi had just announced to the community that she had returned empty. Still, the moment of their arrival contained one fact Naomi's lament had not yet interpreted. They came at the beginning of the barley harvest. The timing mattered immediately. Barley was among the first major grains harvested in the agricultural year. Its ripening opened the spring harvest season, to be followed by wheat. For landowners and laborers, the weeks ahead would be filled with cutting, gathering, binding, transporting, threshing, and winnowing. Fields that had stood green would become places of concentrated work and food. Naomi had left because the land failed to provide. She returned as Bethlehem's fields began to yield. The contrast was sharp enough to carry its own promise, but not yet a guarantee. A harvest in the surrounding fields meant that grain existed. It did not mean Ruth and Naomi owned it. The crops belonged to households whose land and labor had produced them. The two widows had arrived before any provision had been arranged. Beginning was the crucial word. They had not reached Bethlehem after the harvest had been gathered and the opportunity for field labor had passed. They arrived as reaping began. The season opened before them, with weeks of barley and wheat work still ahead. Harvest also brought the town into motion. Landowners watched the progress of their fields. Overseers directed hired workers. Reapers cut the standing grain, and women followed to gather and bind what had been cut. At the edges of that activity, the poor could seek what Israel's customs allowed them to collect from the remnants. That provision would soon become Ruth's point of entry into Bethlehem's life. For now, it existed only as part of the season surrounding her. She had not yet stepped into a field or met the man whose land would change the direction of both widows' lives. The arrival at harvest therefore placed fullness and emptiness beside each other. Naomi declared herself empty, while grain ripened around Bethlehem. She asked to be called bitter, while the town entered the season that had drawn her home. Ruth stood as evidence of a loyalty Naomi could not yet count as restoration. The fields held food, but the widows had to find a lawful way to reach it. Naomi's lament deserved to stand without quick correction. Her husband and sons remained dead. No later abundance could make those deaths unreal. The story does not answer bitterness by pretending that loss was small. Instead, it begins moving through the resources still present. A living daughter-in-law, a remembered family connection, an ancestral town, laws that made room for the vulnerable, and a harvest ready to be gathered. None of those resources had yet converged. Naomi knew the town, but saw herself as empty. Ruth possessed strength and loyalty, but had no established place. Elimelech's relatives existed somewhere within the wider community, but no relative had appeared at their arrival. The grain stood in fields belonging to other people. The women of Bethlehem had asked whether the returning widow was Naomi. Her answer defined the first public understanding of the two women. One was Mara, marked by bitterness. The other was Ruth the Moabite, marked by foreignness. That was how they entered. They had shelter enough to remain together, but their food would have to come from the harvest now beginning. Each day mattered. Grain left standing too long would be cut. Fields once cleared would offer little. The season that created opportunity also limited it. Ruth had pledged to go where Naomi went and stay where Naomi stayed. Bethlehem now gave that promise its practical test. Loyalty on the road had required endurance. Loyalty in the town would require work. Around them, the first barley was ready for the sickle. Ruth turned to Naomi and asked permission to go into the fields. "Let me go and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." The request was modest, but it was active. Ruth did not wait for grain to arrive at their door or for one of Elimelech's relatives to notice their need. She proposed entering the harvest herself and gathering whatever the reapers left available. Naomi answered, "Go, my daughter." The form of address confirmed that Ruth's place beside her had survived the arrival in Bethlehem. Naomi had tried to send both daughters-in-law back to Moab, but Ruth's oath had settled the matter. In the town where Ruth remained visibly foreign, Naomi called her daughter. Ruth went out. Gleaning offered a lawful means of survival to people who possessed no harvest of their own. Israel's law instructed landowners not to strip every part of a field. They were not to reap every edge with perfect efficiency or return, to gather every stalk that fell. What remained was to be left for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreign resident. The practice did not place grain directly into anyone's hands. It created access. A gleaner still had to enter a field, follow the harvesters, stoop for scattered stalks, collect them, carry them away, separate the kernels, and turn the yield into food. The law preserved dignity by allowing work, but the work was slow and physically demanding. It also placed vulnerable people inside another household's operation. The landowner controlled the field. An overseer directed the labor. Reapers worked with sickles through the standing grain, and other workers gathered what they cut. A gleaner occupied the margins of that organized activity and depended on those in authority to honor the custom. Ruth understood that permission on paper and acceptance in practice were not always the same. Her request was to glean behind a man in whose eyes she found favor. She needed more than an unreaped corner. She needed a field where her presence would be allowed and where the workers would not drive her away. Her Moabite identity made that favor especially important. The law included the foreign resident among those protected by gleaning, but Ruth had only just arrived. She had no established reputation in the fields, and no male member of her household accompanying her. The people she met would first see a young foreign widow working alone. Ruth entered the agricultural world surrounding Bethlehem and began following the reapers. The harvest had its own order. Reapers moved ahead, cutting handfuls of barley. Behind them came the work of gathering and binding. Gleaners followed farther back, searching the ground for what had fallen or remained. They worked from another household's abundance without being part of its hired labor force. Every handful Ruth collected came through a combination of law, labor, and human conduct. The custom made room for her, but the behavior of a landowner and his workers determined whether that room felt secure or hostile. Ruth could ask to glean. She could not command the welcome she needed. She came to a portion of field and worked there. Only after placing her among its reapers does the account identify the owner. The land belonged to Boaz. His name had not yet entered Ruth's experience in Bethlehem, but he was already connected to the household whose future she had chosen to share. Boaz belonged to the clan of Elimelech. That kinship link had practical significance. A clan joined related households within the larger tribe and community. Its members shared ancestry, reputation, and certain responsibilities toward family property and family members in distress. Naomi's losses had not erased Elimelech's wider kin. Somewhere in Bethlehem, the dead man's family connections remained alive. Boaz was one of those connections. He was also a man of substantial standing. The description can carry the sense of wealth, strength, ability, and respected position. In this setting, Boaz possessed what Ruth and Naomi lacked: land under harvest, workers under authority, an established name in Bethlehem, and a recognized place among Elimelech's relatives. The contrast was immediate. Ruth entered the field as a gleaner dependent on what others left. Boaz owned the crop being cut. Ruth had no standing beyond her connection to Naomi. Boaz's standing was already known. Ruth was newly arrived from Moab. Boaz belonged to the same Bethlehem clan as Elimelech, yet neither Ruth nor Boaz had arranged this meeting. Ruth's arrival in his field is described as a chance occurrence. She went out seeking favor wherever she might find it, and the portion of land she reached happened to belong to Boaz. From Ruth's point of view, it was an ordinary choice made without privileged knowledge. She needed grain, saw harvesters, and began to glean. She did not select the field because she knew the owner was Naomi's relative. The family connection existed before she became aware of it. That quiet convergence gives the scene its force. Ruth's decision to work brought her into the field. The law of gleaning gave her a place behind the reapers. The field's ownership placed her within reach of a man connected to Elimelech. Nothing had yet been promised, and no one had announced what the meeting might mean. For the moment, Ruth bent to the immediate task. A gleaner's progress could be measured in fragments. One stalk on the ground, then another. A small cluster missed by the cutting. Loose heads gathered into an armful. The harvest moved forward in broad swaths. The gleaner advanced by remnants. That difference marked the distance between Ruth and the household around her. The workers belonged to an organized harvest, expected to produce stores of grain. Ruth worked for the day's food. She had brought willingness and strength into the field, but she did not control how much the reapers would leave. Her labor also fulfilled the commitment she had made to Naomi in a new form. On the road, Ruth had pledged to stay where Naomi stayed. In Bethlehem, staying required provision. Ruth now used the one opportunity open to a landless widow and directed its benefit toward their shared household. While she worked, Boaz came from Bethlehem. His arrival brought the owner into the field at the point when the foreign gleaner was already present. Boaz did not enter as a distant figure insulated from the labor. He came among the reapers and spoke to them. "The Lord be with you," he said. They answered, "The Lord bless you." The exchange was brief and ordinary enough to function as a workplace greeting, yet it revealed the character of authority in the field. Boaz greeted his workers with the name of Israel's God. The workers returned the blessing. Their response suggests a relationship in which such words could be exchanged openly rather than forced from silence. The greeting also placed Ruth's new allegiance within hearing of daily life in Bethlehem. On the road, she had told Naomi, "Your God will be my God." In this field, the landowner and his reapers invoked that God at the beginning of their interaction. Boaz then looked across the harvest operation. His workers were familiar to him. A young man had been appointed over the reapers, responsible for supervising the activity and able to account for those present. The field was organized closely enough that a new person stood out. Ruth stood out. She was behind the reapers, occupying the place permitted to a gleaner but not belonging to the regular company of workers. Her clothing, speech, or simple unfamiliarity may have marked her as new. What mattered was that Boaz recognized someone whose place in the field had not yet been explained to him. He addressed the overseer. "Whose young woman is this?" The question sought her social connection. In Bethlehem, a person was ordinarily identified through household, kin, or community, someone's daughter, wife, servant, or dependent. To ask whose she was meant asking where she belonged and who stood behind her. Ruth's answer would be complicated. Her father's household was in Moab. Her husband was dead. Her present bond was to Naomi, another widow. She had entered the field under the protection offered to the poor and the foreigner, but she had no powerful household visibly claiming her. Boaz did not yet address Ruth directly. Before deciding how to respond to her presence, he asked the man responsible for the reapers to identify her. The question brought two lines of the story together. Boaz belonged to Elimelech's clan, though Ruth did not know it. Ruth belonged with Naomi by a loyalty Boaz had not yet heard described. The field between them was filled with evidence. A foreign woman working behind his reapers from the opening of the harvest. Boaz waited for the overseer's answer. "Whose young woman is this?" The overseer answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the country of Moab." Ruth's identity had already become known in Bethlehem. The overseer did not give her father's name or identify her through Mahlon. He placed her within the story the town had witnessed. She was the foreign daughter-in-law who had come back with Naomi. He then reported how she had entered the field. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." Ruth had not assumed that legal provision entitled her to disrupt the workers. She had approached those responsible for the harvest and asked. Her request concerned both gleaning and gathering. She wanted to follow behind the reapers, collect what remained, and assemble it for removal. The overseer continued, "She came and has remained from morning until now, except for a short rest." Boaz had noticed Ruth only after arriving from Bethlehem, but the overseer had watched her work. She had begun early and continued through the day. Her status as a poor foreigner explained why she was in the field. Her labor distinguished what she did once admitted. That report answered more than Boaz's question. He had asked whose young woman she was. The overseer identified her connection to Naomi, her Moabite origin, her respectful request, and her persistence. Ruth had no father or husband present to establish her reputation, so her conduct in the field spoke before she did. Boaz approached her. "Listen, my daughter." His first words gave Ruth a place in the conversation that was warmer than the overseer's identification. She had been described as the Moabite woman. Boaz called her daughter. He was not claiming a paternal relationship, but he addressed her with the respect and protective authority of an older man toward a younger woman within his care. "Do not go to glean in another field," he said. "Do not leave this one. Stay close to my young women." The instruction changed Ruth's situation immediately. A gleaner might ordinarily move wherever grain appeared available, facing new workers and new uncertainty each time. Boaz removed that need. She could remain in his field throughout the ongoing harvest work. He placed her near the women attached to his household. These women followed the reapers as part of the organized labor, gathering what the men cut and assisting in the harvest. By telling Ruth to stay close to them, Boaz moved her from the isolated edge of the operation toward a recognized company. "Keep your eyes on the field they are reaping," he continued, "and follow after the women." Ruth would not have to negotiate her access each morning or guess where she might be permitted to work. She could watch the progress of Boaz's reapers and continue behind his women as the harvest moved from one portion of land to another. Then Boaz addressed the danger surrounding a woman alone among workers. "I have commanded the young men not to touch you." The order gave Ruth protection under the landowner's direct authority. The men working with sickles and moving through the fields were not to strike, molest, harass, or interfere with her. Boaz did not leave her safety to their individual goodwill. He issued a command. That protection mattered because gleaning placed Ruth in a dependent position. She needed access to the space where others worked, and she possessed little power to answer mistreatment. Boaz used his control of the field to set a boundary around her. He also gave her access to water. "When you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Drawing water required time and labor. Workers needed it through the heat and exertion of harvesting, and the filled vessels belonged to the resources of Boaz's operation. Ruth had entered expecting to collect leftover grain. Boaz allowed her to drink from the supply prepared for his people. The gesture removed another vulnerability. Ruth would not have to leave the field to search for water, carry all she needed herself, or ask repeatedly for permission. She could work within reach of provision already drawn by the men. Each part of Boaz's instruction answered a practical need. Remain in this field. Continuity. Stay with the women. Belonging. Follow the harvest. Access. The men will not touch you. Protection. Drink from the vessels. Provision. He had done more than permit gleaning. He had rearranged the field around Ruth's safety. Ruth fell face down and bowed to the ground. Her posture acknowledged the distance in standing between them. Boaz was the owner and master of the workers. Ruth was a foreign widow gathering remnants from his crop. He had spoken to her with generosity beyond what she had requested. She asked, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Ruth understood that Boaz's response could not be explained by ordinary obligation alone. Gleaning law made space for a foreigner to gather. It did not require a landowner to attach her to his women, command his men concerning her, or open the workers' water supply. Her question also showed that she did not assume Naomi's family connection had secured the favor. Ruth had entered the field without knowing its owner. Boaz had not introduced himself as Elimelech's relative. From her perspective, a prominent Bethlehemite had noticed someone whose foreignness should have made her easy to overlook. Boaz answered by telling Ruth that she had been seen before he entered the field. "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully reported to me." Ruth's actions in Moab and on the road had reached Bethlehem. The town's first agitation at Naomi's arrival had carried more than surprise. People had learned how the Moabite daughter-in-law came to be standing beside her. Boaz knew that Ruth had remained with Naomi after Mahlon's death. He knew that her loyalty began before there was any possibility of reward in Judah. She had cared for a widow who believed herself empty and had followed her into a future Naomi repeatedly described as barren. Boaz continued, "I have been told how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth, and came to a people you did not know before." His words named the full direction of Ruth's choice. She had not simply traveled with Naomi. She had left her father and mother, the most immediate human ties of her birth household. She had left the land where her identity was native. She had come to people with whom she had no previous life. In Moab, Ruth's decision had been witnessed by Naomi and Orpah. In Bethlehem, its consequences were visible to everyone who met her. Boaz's knowledge joined those two settings. He understood that the foreign woman in his field was foreign because she had surrendered the protection of home in order to preserve her bond with Naomi. That changed the meaning of Ruth's vulnerability. Her need was real, but Boaz did not treat her only as a needy person. He saw moral weight in the path that had brought her to glean. She had become poor in Bethlehem through an act of loyalty. Her lack of standing was connected to the courage with which she had left an established place. Boaz then blessed her. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth had asked why Boaz noticed her. His answer moved from public reputation to divine shelter. The people of Bethlehem had heard of her conduct. Boaz asked Israel's God to answer it. The image of wings expressed protection. A bird gathers its young beneath its wings, placing its own body between them and danger. Ruth had left the protection of her native household and entered Israel without a husband or father beside her. Boaz understood her arrival as a movement toward refuge under the Lord. That refuge was not abstract in the field. Ruth was already receiving it through human obedience and generosity. Israel's law allowed her to glean. Boaz's command protected her from the men. His water sustained her work. His invitation to remain gave her a secure place through the harvest. Boaz prayed for a full reward, but the encounter had not yet defined what such a reward might include. At that moment, it meant that Ruth's costly loyalty was known and that her need had come within the attention of a man able to act. His blessing also answered Naomi's earlier blessing in Moab. Naomi had asked the Lord to deal kindly with Ruth and Orpah because they had dealt kindly with the dead and with her. Now Boaz, unaware of that roadside farewell, asked the Lord to repay Ruth for precisely that faithfulness. Ruth had entered Bethlehem identified as a foreigner. Boaz did not deny the label. He placed it within a new meaning. She was a foreigner who had come for refuge beneath the wings of Israel's God. Ruth replied, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not even like one of your female servants." She did not claim equality with the women of Boaz's household. They had recognized positions among his workers. Ruth remained a gleaner who had arrived from outside. Yet Boaz had spoken to her in a way that eased the burden of that difference. His words had comforted her because they acknowledged both her loss and her loyalty. He knew about her husband's death. He knew what she had left. He knew why she was with Naomi. Ruth no longer stood before him as an unexplained foreign presence at the edge of the field. She asked that his favor continue. The request was no longer a hope directed toward an unknown landowner. Ruth now knew whose field she had entered and how its master regarded her. Boaz had given instructions that could shape the rest of her labor there. Around them, the harvest continued. Reapers cut the barley. Women gathered behind them. Water stood ready in the vessels. Ruth had begun the day seeking permission to collect what might be left. By the time Boaz finished speaking, she had a protected place among his people. At mealtime, Boaz spoke to Ruth again. "Come here, eat some of the bread and dip your piece in the vinegar." The invitation moved her another step inward. Ruth had entered the field behind the reapers and described herself as lower in standing than Boaz's female servants. Now the owner called her to the workers' meal. Bread supplied the substance of the meal. The vinegar was a sour wine mixture used as a simple accompaniment, giving flavor and refreshment during field labor. These were ordinary provisions for people spending the day at harvest, but Ruth had not earned a place at their table as a hired worker. Boaz included her by invitation. She sat beside the reapers. The arrangement brought the foreign gleaner into the company, whose remnants she had been collecting. Earlier, she had followed at a distance, determined by the work. During the meal, she occupied the same resting place and received food from the same provision. Boaz passed roasted grain to her. The barley had been heated and prepared for immediate eating, a practical harvest food requiring no elaborate preparation. Boaz did not merely permit Ruth to take something from a shared supply. He personally reached out and gave it to her. Ruth ate until she was satisfied. For a woman who had begun the morning seeking scattered heads of grain, satisfaction at midday was significant. She did not have to ration the portion against the uncertainty of the afternoon. Boaz gave enough for her to eat fully. She also had some left over. That remaining food would matter beyond the field. Boaz's generosity had already exceeded Ruth's immediate hunger, producing something she could preserve after the meal. Without a speech or request, the provision began extending toward Naomi. Then Ruth rose to glean. The meal did not end her work. She returned to the field and resumed gathering behind the harvesters. Boaz's protection had made the field safe for her, and his food had strengthened her. But Ruth still carried out the labor through which grain would enter their household. As she went, Boaz gave further instructions to the young men. Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not humiliate her. Ordinarily, the sheaves represented grain already claimed by the harvest operation. Reapers cut the stalks, and gatherers assembled them into bundles. A gleaner's place was behind that process, collecting what had escaped it. Allowing Ruth among the sheaves brought her close to the gathered crop, where workers might otherwise suspect interference or rebuke her for crossing a boundary. Boaz removed that danger. His men were to let her work there without shaming her. The command protected Ruth's dignity as carefully as the earlier order had protected her body. Poverty made a gleaner dependent on access controlled by others. A harsh word, accusation, or public rebuke could turn lawful labor into humiliation and drive a vulnerable person from the field. Boaz forbade his workers from using that power against her. Then he went further. Pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to glean. Do not rebuke her. The young men were to create abundance deliberately. As they handled the cut barley, they were to draw stalks from what had already been gathered and place them where Ruth could collect them. This was no longer the accidental remainder of an imperfect harvest. Boaz was directing part of his yield toward her, yet he arranged the gift within Ruth's work. The stalks would be left in her path, and she would glean them. She would still bend, gather, carry, and process the barley herself. Boaz increased the result without turning her into a passive spectator. His repeated command against rebuke ensured that the unusual permission could not be undermined by the workers carrying it out. Ruth was to collect what appeared before her, without being accused of taking what belonged to the sheaves. The men knew that the abundance was intentional, even if every stalk looked to Ruth like part of the field's opportunity. Boaz's favor now shaped the entire harvest environment around her. He had given her a stable place, attached her to his women, restrained his men, opened the water vessels, included her at the meal, and ordered grain released into her path. Each act answered a different form of insecurity. Together they allowed Ruth to work with confidence that the field's owner wanted her there. She gleaned until evening. The length of the day completes the overseer's earlier report. Ruth had worked from morning, paused for the meal and brief rest, then returned to gathering until the harvest day ended. Favor had enlarged her opportunity, but it did not shorten the labor required to make use of it. Throughout the afternoon, the reapers advanced through the barley while Ruth followed. Some stalks lay where the cutting had missed them. Others had fallen naturally. Still others had been pulled from the bundles because Boaz commanded it. Ruth gathered them all into what she could carry. The distinction between chance and generosity was visible to Boaz and his workers. Ruth's task remained the same: Take the grain made available and keep working. By evening, she had accumulated enough unprocessed barley to require another stage of labor. She beat out what she had gleaned. Grain in the field remained attached to stalks and enclosed within the harvested heads. Before it could be ground into flour or cooked, the edible kernels had to be separated from the surrounding plant material. Larger harvests would be threshed with animals, sledges, or heavier equipment at a threshing floor. Ruth handled a gleaner's collection directly, striking or beating the stalks until the grain came free. This work reduced a bulky mass of stalks to the concentrated food they contained. What she would take away was not an impressive armful that might prove mostly straw. It was usable barley. When Ruth finished, the grain measured about an ephah. An ephah was a large, dry measure, commonly estimated at roughly 20 liters. Exact modern equivalents cannot capture every ancient local practice, but the narrative's point is unmistakable. This was an extraordinary yield for one gleaner after one day. The amount stood far beyond a single meal. Barley could be ground for bread, roasted, boiled, or stored. In a household of 2 widows, an ephah represented sustained provision. Ruth's effort explains part of the result. She had arrived early, remained through the day, and processed the collection herself. Boaz's orders explain the abundance surrounding that effort. The field did not simply happen to leave an ephah behind. The owner had instructed his men to loosen grain from the bundles and allow her to gather close to the sheaves. The yield therefore joined Ruth's character to Boaz's character without confusing their roles. Ruth worked, Boaz gave. His giving made her work unusually fruitful. Her work carried his generosity into a form that could feed Naomi's household. Nothing had yet been said between them about Elimelech's land, family redemption, or marriage. Boaz's actions remained those of a landowner, extending protection and abundance to a woman whose loyalty he respected. The larger family connection had not entered their conversation, but the field was already doing more than supplying food. Ruth had begun the morning hoping to find favor in the eyes of an unknown person. By evening, that favor could be measured. It lay in the security of an entire day without harassment, in the meal that had satisfied her, in the food left over from that meal, and in the grain separated beneath her hands. The measure also marked a reversal in the household's immediate condition. Naomi had entered Bethlehem, speaking of emptiness. Ruth now stood over a quantity of barley produced by a field neither woman owned. That grain had come through a chain of decisions. Ruth chose to glean. The overseer admitted her. Boaz noticed her. Her reputation moved him to act. His workers obeyed. Ruth remained until the work was finished. The day began with uncertainty over whether any landowner would look favorably upon a Moabite widow. It ended with Boaz using his authority to make certain that she gathered far more than chance alone would have supplied. Even then, Ruth did not leave the barley in its rough harvested form. She completed the beating and separation before the day's result was known. Only when stalk and husk had been removed could the true yield be seen. About an ephah of barley remained. Ruth lifted the grain and carried it into the town. Naomi saw what she had gleaned. The amount required no explanation before it made an impression. Ruth had left seeking permission to gather remnants and returned with enough processed barley to supply them well beyond that evening. The harvest had yielded to her as though she had worked under the favor of someone with authority over the field. Ruth then brought out the roasted grain left from her meal and gave it to Naomi. The food revealed another part of the day. Ruth had not merely been allowed to glean successfully, she had been fed until satisfied and had preserved the surplus for her mother-in-law. Before the newly gathered barley was ground or cooked, Naomi received something ready to eat. Naomi asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work?" The repeated question showed that the yield could not be treated as ordinary. Naomi understood harvest life in Bethlehem. An ephah of grain and leftover prepared food pointed to deliberate favor. She added a blessing before hearing the man's name. "Blessed be the one who took notice of you." Naomi had entered Bethlehem, believing that the Lord had brought her back empty. Now she looked at Ruth's return from the field and recognized that someone had seen the foreign widow and acted on her behalf. Ruth told her about the man with whom she had worked. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." The name changed Naomi's understanding of everything before her. She said, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Her first response was blessing. The same woman who had spoken publicly of divine bitterness now spoke of enduring kindness. The living were Ruth and Naomi, fed and protected through the generosity of Boaz's field. The dead remained Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, whose households seemed to have ended in Moab. Boaz's connection reached both groups. His grain helped the widows who survived, and his family relationship connected his actions to the men who were gone. Naomi saw more than a fortunate day of gleaning. The kindness embodied in Boaz's attention suggested that the family of the dead had not vanished from Bethlehem's concern. She explained, "The man is a close relative of ours. He is one of our redeemers." Ruth had learned that Boaz knew her story, but Naomi now gave her knowledge she had not possessed in the field. The landowner who protected her belonged to Elimelech's extended family. The word redeemer described a relative able to act when a family member's life, liberty, property, or line was in danger. Kinship carried practical responsibility. A redeemer could recover family land lost through poverty, help preserve a household's place within the clan, and intervene where a relative lacked the power to rescue himself. Nearness mattered because these obligations followed family order. A person could be generous without being a redeemer. A redeemer acted because he stood within the threatened family and possessed the means to help. Boaz qualified in both respects. He belonged to Elimelech's clan, and his field showed that he had resources and standing. He was not simply a compassionate stranger encountered by chance. He was a man whose relationship to Naomi's dead husband gave his favor wider possibilities. Naomi carefully called him one of their redeemers. Boaz was close, but he was not necessarily the only relative with a claim or responsibility. The discovery opened a path. It did not settle where that path would lead. For Ruth, this was a second recognition of the same day. In the field, she had discovered that Boaz knew what she had done for Naomi. At home, she discovered that Naomi knew who Boaz was within Elimelech's family. The barley between them now carried a family meaning. Boaz had prayed that the Lord would reward Ruth for seeking refuge under his wings. Naomi recognized his generosity as evidence that kindness had not abandoned the household. Neither woman yet spoke of how Boaz might act as redeemer. The immediate facts were enough. A relative had noticed Ruth, protected her, fed her, and made her labor fruitful. Ruth then reported another part of Boaz's instruction. "He also said to me, 'Stay close to my workers until they have finished all my harvest.'" The invitation extended beyond one extraordinary day. Boaz's protection and favor would remain available as his workers moved through the season. Naomi approved. "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, so that you are not harmed in another field." Naomi understood the value of the arrangement at once. Ruth had found a place where the landowner had personally commanded her safety. Leaving it to search for grain elsewhere would expose her to workers who knew nothing of Boaz's orders and owners who had made no commitment to her. The possibility of harm was serious enough to shape Naomi's counsel. Gleaning required Ruth to enter spaces governed by men whose conduct she could not control. Boaz's field was now different. His authority stood behind her presence. Naomi directed Ruth specifically toward the young women. Staying near them placed her among the female workers of the household rather than alone among the reapers. It also kept her conduct within the visible order Boaz had established. The advice joined prudence to opportunity. Ruth did not need to interpret one generous day as permission to wander wherever the harvest looked richest. The safest and most fruitful course was also the simplest: remain where favor had already been given. Ruth did so. She stayed close to the young women of Boaz and gleaned until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were finished. The single day expanded into a season. Barley ripened first and wheat followed. Over the weeks between them, workers continued cutting and gathering as different fields reached readiness. Ruth remained attached to Boaz's harvest through both stages. This continuity mattered more than a single large measure of grain. One effort could answer immediate hunger. Repeated access could establish a supply capable of carrying the two women beyond the first days after their return. Each morning in Boaz's fields also confirmed that his favor had not been a passing response to novelty. His instructions remained in force. Ruth could follow the women, use the workers' water, and glean where the harvest advanced. The men knew not to touch or rebuke her. The arrangement gave Ruth a recognized pattern of life in Bethlehem. She was still a gleaner rather than a landowner or hired servant, but she was no longer moving anonymously from field to field. She worked among people who knew who she was and why Boaz had made room for her. Her reputation could now grow through sustained conduct. The overseer had reported her diligence on the first morning. The following weeks allowed the workers and townspeople to see that the report described her ordinary manner of work. Boaz's reputation also became concrete to Ruth over time. She had first encountered him through a greeting, a command of protection, a meal, and a blessing. Remaining through his harvest allowed her to observe the order of his household and the way his instructions were carried out. The protection he promised continued to shape her daily safety. The story keeps their relationship within the public work of the fields. Ruth stayed with Boaz's women. She labored through the harvest. Boaz's generosity was real, but it did not become a sequence of invented private meetings. What grew between the households grew through visible action, family knowledge, and provision. At the end of each day, Ruth returned to Naomi. She continued living with her mother-in-law. That statement preserves the center of Ruth's choice. Boaz had become important, but Ruth had come to Bethlehem because she clung to Naomi. The grain from his land entered the household the two widows shared. Their life together was now more stable than at the moment of arrival. They had access to food through Ruth's labor. Ruth had a safe field. Naomi had identified a close relative capable of serving as redeemer. The immediate threat of hunger had eased, but harvest security was temporary by nature. When the cutting ended, gleaning ended with it. Grain gathered during the season could be stored and used, but Ruth's place behind the reapers did not give her land, inheritance, or a permanent household. She remained a widow living with a widow. Naomi had asked the Lord in Moab to give Ruth rest in the house of another husband. That hope had seemed impossible when Naomi sent her away. Boaz's appearance made family restoration conceivable, but no promise had been made, nor did the existence of a redeemer automatically produce action. Kinship identified who might bear responsibility. Circumstances still had to bring the need before him. Boaz had chosen to protect Ruth as a gleaner. He had not yet undertaken the larger obligations connected to Elimelech's household. The end of harvest, therefore, changed the pressure without removing it. Ruth and Naomi had survived their arrival. They had food where they once had none. The foreign widow had gained a respected place in Boaz's fields, and Naomi had begun speaking of kindness rather than abandonment. Yet the central losses still governed their future. Elimelech's property needed continuity. The dead sons had no descendants. Ruth's youth and loyalty had produced provision, but provision alone could not give her the settled rest Naomi desired for her. Through barley and wheat harvest, the two women lived within Boaz's favor. When the fields had been fully reaped, Naomi began to consider what that favor might require next. Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, so that it may be well with you?" The question returned to the hope Naomi had spoken over Ruth on the road from Moab. Then she had believed that rest could be found only if Ruth went back to her own people and entered another husband's house. Ruth had refused to leave. Now Naomi saw a possible way for that security to be sought in Bethlehem. Her concern reached beyond food. Gleaning had carried them through the harvest, but Ruth needed a settled place that would endure after the fields were bare. Rest meant belonging within a household, protection that did not depend on seasonal labor, and a future established through marriage and family. Naomi intended to act on Ruth's behalf. She said, "Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you have been?" The weeks of harvest had confirmed the connection. Boaz had protected Ruth publicly and consistently. He had shown kindness toward Naomi's household without being compelled by a formal claim. He was also near enough to Elimelech's family to bear the title of Redeemer. Naomi now brought those facts together. This very night, he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. The work of harvest did not end when the stalks were cut. Grain had to be brought to a prepared area where the heads could be threshed and the kernels separated from straw and husk. After threshing came winnowing. Workers tossed the loosened mixture into moving air. The heavier grain fell back to the floor while the lighter chaff was carried aside. Evening and night winds could make those hours especially useful, so work at the threshing floor might continue after the heat of the day. The grain gathered there represented the yield of weeks of labor and much of a household's food and wealth for the coming year. Someone responsible often remained near it until it could be secured. Boaz would therefore be present at the floor through the night. Naomi gave Ruth detailed instructions. "Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your clothes, and go down to the threshing floor." Washing and applying oil were ordinary forms of preparation. Ruth was not to arrive directly from labor in the fields. She would present herself deliberately for a meeting that concerned her future. The preparation also separated this night from her daily identity as a gleaner. In Boaz's fields, Ruth came dressed for work, remained with the women, and gathered grain under public protection. At the threshing floor, she would approach him after the work was complete and place a private family matter before him.
"You are ready."
Naomi continued, "Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." Timing was central to the plan. Ruth was not to interrupt the winnowing or approach Boaz while workers still required his attention. She would wait until the labor had ended, the meal was finished, and he had settled for the night. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. A threshing floor could hold workers, grain, tools, and separate piles belonging to different owners. Darkness would make careless movement dangerous to the plan and to Ruth's reputation. She had to know exactly where Boaz rested. Naomi then told her what to do once she had identified the place. "Go, uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what you are to do." The instructions ended at the point of encounter. Ruth was to place herself at Boaz's feet in a posture that combined humility with unmistakable purpose. Uncovering his feet would eventually wake him and force the private meeting into speech. The action itself would not settle what the meeting meant. Boaz would have to respond. Naomi expected him to recognize the situation and tell Ruth what should follow. This was a daring plan. The town gate was the ordinary place for elders, witnesses, land transactions, and disputed rights. The threshing floor at night offered none of that public structure. Ruth would go alone to a place where men had been working, wait until Boaz slept, and lie at his feet. Her safety in the field had rested on Boaz's public commands. At the threshing floor, she would depend directly on his character. Her reputation was also exposed. Ruth had become known in Bethlehem through loyalty and diligent work. An encounter misunderstood by others could damage that standing. Naomi's instruction to wait, observe, and approach only after Boaz had settled limited exposure, but it could not remove the risk. Boaz faced risk as well. He was a man of standing whose conduct affected his household and his name in Bethlehem. Ruth's presence beside him during the night would require a response that protected both of them while dealing honestly with the claim Naomi intended to raise. The plan relied on what Boaz had already revealed. He had restrained his men when Ruth was vulnerable. He had offered food without exploiting her need. He had blessed her loyalty and treated her foreignness with dignity. Naomi now entrusted Ruth to that same integrity in a setting without witnesses. Yet Naomi did not tell Ruth what Boaz's answer would be. His status as a relative made action possible, but kinship did not allow Naomi to dictate his decision. Boaz possessed responsibilities and rights of his own. If the future of Elimelech's household was to pass through him, he would have to accept that role. Ruth listened to the entire plan. "Everything you say, I will do," she answered. Her response continued the pattern established on the road. Naomi sought Ruth's good, and Ruth entrusted herself to Naomi's direction. This time, however, obedience did not mean walking beside her. Ruth had to go where Naomi would not go and speak to Boaz for herself. She washed, anointed herself, dressed, and went down to the threshing floor. The movement took her away from the shared household and toward the place where Boaz's harvest was being completed. During the preceding weeks, grain had flowed from his fields into Naomi's home through Ruth's labor. Now Ruth followed the harvested grain back to its owner. She arrived without announcing herself to Boaz. The work was still proceeding. Barley that had been cut, gathered, and threshed now had to be cleaned through winnowing. Boaz remained occupied with the crop and the people handling it. Ruth waited. This was an essential part of her obedience. Naomi had not sent her to seize an opportunity at the first sight of Boaz. She was to remain unnoticed until the proper moment. Her task was to watch where he lay down after the work and meal. The waiting preserved the order of the evening. Boaz completed the responsibility that had brought him to the floor. The harvest belonged to a whole household, and its processing could not be abandoned for a private matter he did not yet know existed. When the winnowing ended, Boaz ate and drank. The meal marked the close of successful work. The barley lay gathered into a heap, separated from much of its chaff and ready for storage and use. Boaz was satisfied after his food and drink. Then he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. His choice placed him beside the harvest entrusted to him. The grain represented provision, seed, trade, wages, and security. Guarding it through the night was a practical act of stewardship. Ruth watched where he lay. The setting gathered the story's pressures into one place. Boaz rested beside an abundant harvest. Ruth waited as a widow whose household had survived by gleaning from that abundance. He possessed land, grain, kinship standing, and the power to act. She carried Naomi's plan and her own vulnerable future. The difference between them had never been more visible. During harvest, Ruth approached Boaz in daylight as a gleaner. He saw her, summoned her, and established the terms of her safety. Now Boaz had not summoned her. He did not yet know she was present. Ruth's earlier work had been performed among women and reapers who could witness her conduct. What came next would happen in darkness before it could ever reach the elders or the town. Naomi had said that Boaz would tell her what to do. But before he could speak, Ruth had to complete the part of the plan that would wake him and reveal why she had come. She remained hidden until he had finished his meal, found his place beside the grain, and fallen asleep. Ruth knew exactly where he lay. Ruth approached quietly. She uncovered Boaz's feet and lay down. The action completed Naomi's instructions, but it did not complete Ruth's purpose. She had entered the threshing floor unnoticed, waited through the work and meal, and identified the place where Boaz slept. Now she placed herself at his feet and waited for him to wake. Nothing had yet been spoken between them. Boaz had not invited her there, and Ruth had not announced what she wanted. The posture itself created the encounter, but its meaning still depended on the words that would follow. Time passed into the middle of the night. Boaz was startled. The exposure at his feet had disturbed his sleep. He turned and discovered that a woman was lying there. The scene forced immediate recognition of danger without identifying its source. Boaz was beside his grain in darkness, and an unexpected person had entered the place where he slept. A woman's presence also carried consequences beyond physical safety. He needed to know who she was before he could understand why she had come. "Who are you?" he asked. Ruth answered clearly. "I am Ruth, your servant." She gave her name before making her claim. Boaz knew Ruth. He had heard the account of her loyalty, watched her work through his harvest, and placed her under his protection. The foreign gleaner was no longer an unknown figure at the edge of his field. Ruth now called herself his servant. During their first conversation, she had said that she did not possess the standing of one of his female servants. Boaz's kindness had comforted her even though she remained outside his household. At the threshing floor, Ruth used the humbler title while asking him to consider bringing her future within his responsibility. Then she went beyond Naomi's instructions. "Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Naomi had told Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet, lie down, and wait for him to say what she should do. Ruth did not remain silent after he woke. She interpreted her presence for him and stated the family claim directly. The request drew upon Boaz's own words in the field. He had prayed that Ruth would receive a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings she had come for refuge. Ruth now asked Boaz to spread his wing over her. The image could be seen in the garment itself. To spread the edge of one's covering over a woman expressed protection and a binding household commitment. Ruth was not asking only for warmth during the night. She was asking Boaz to take responsibility for her as a husband and to act for the family of the dead. Her words turned blessing into obligation. Boaz had spoken of refuge beneath God's wings. Ruth asked whether he would become the human means through which that refuge took form. His prayer in the field had recognized her faithfulness. Her appeal at the threshing floor required him to decide what his own faithfulness demanded. She gave the reason in the same sentence. "You are a redeemer." Ruth's claim did not rest on attraction, private affection, or an invented courtship. It rested on kinship. Boaz belonged to Elimelech's family. He had the standing to intervene where the household had lost land, sons, and future continuity. This made the encounter larger than Ruth's personal security. Marriage could provide Ruth with rest, but the need extended to Naomi and to the names of the men who had died. Elimelech's household had property in Bethlehem and no surviving male descendant. Mahlon had died without a child. If Ruth entered a new household entirely detached from that family, her future might improve while the dead man's line still disappeared. A redeemer could bind those concerns together. By accepting Ruth and acting for the family property, a close relative could preserve the threatened inheritance within the clan and raise up a future connected to the dead. The request was therefore personal, legal, and familial at once. Ruth stood at its center because she was Mahlon's widow. Her marriage to him had brought her into Elimelech's household. Her loyalty to Naomi had carried that bond back to Bethlehem. Now she asked a living relative to acknowledge that the obligations of kinship had survived the deaths in Moab. The ancient customs involved did not reduce Ruth to property transferred between men. Her action drove the scene. Naomi devised the approach, but Ruth chose to carry it out and formulated the appeal in her own words. Boaz possessed the power to answer, yet Ruth was the one who placed the duty before him. Her request also differed from a demand enforced in a public court. No elders stood around them. No witnesses listened. Ruth appealed first to Boaz's character and family loyalty. If he accepted responsibility, the public and legal steps would still have to follow. That made the nighttime setting consequential. Ruth gave Boaz the opportunity to respond before reputation, land, and witnesses shaped the matter at the gate. The privacy allowed direct speech. It also exposed her to the character of the man she addressed. Boaz could have treated her presence as an intrusion. He could have protected his standing at her expense. He could have limited his earlier generosity to grain and refused the more costly obligations attached to redemption. Ruth had no authority over his response. She did possess the moral force of the truth she spoke. Boaz was a redeemer. He belonged near enough to the family for Naomi to identify him as one. He had praised Ruth for leaving her father, mother, and native land to care for Naomi. He had asked the Lord to reward her. The household whose widow he admired now stood before him, asking whether his kinship meant action. Ruth's appeal created a reversal between the field and the threshing floor. In the field, Boaz had noticed Ruth and initiated every act of favor. He told her where to glean, commanded her safety, gave her water and food, and directed grain into her path. Ruth responded with gratitude. At the threshing floor, Ruth initiated. She came to Boaz, woke him through the sign Naomi had prescribed, and told him what she sought. Boaz was now the one required to respond. The language of wings deepened that reversal. Earlier, Boaz had described Ruth as someone who sought shelter. At that moment, she possessed no power to create the refuge for herself. At midnight, she named the form that shelter could take. Divine care would not remain only a blessing spoken over her. It could enter land, marriage, inheritance, and descendants through the decision of a responsible relative. Ruth did not ask Boaz to erase her Moabite past. She identified herself by the name under which he knew her. Her claim arose from what she had become within Naomi's family, not from pretending she had always belonged to Bethlehem. She also did not speak as though his kindness in the fields had already obligated him to marry her. She named the relevant bond. He was a redeemer. His generosity showed that he cared. His kinship created the ground on which she could ask for more. The appeal brought Naomi's hopes into the open. Naomi had asked whether she should seek rest for Ruth. Ruth now sought that rest through a commitment that could restore both women. If Boaz spread his wing over her, Ruth could enter a stable household, and Naomi's family could regain a future through the same act. That possibility had remained unspoken during the harvest. Ruth worked beside Boaz's women without turning his protection into romance. Boaz fed her without claiming her. Their public conduct established trust before any marriage claim was made. Now the harvest was ending, and the matter could no longer be left inside acts of seasonal generosity. Grain could feed the widows, but grain could not perpetuate a name. Ruth asked Boaz to move from benefactor to redeemer. Her words were concise, because the situation had already supplied their weight. She lay at his feet, identifying herself as his servant. He rested beside the abundance of his harvest. She possessed no field. He belonged to the family whose field and name were in danger of passing away. She asked him to place the protection symbolized by his garment over her. The request also placed Boaz under the authority of the God he had invoked. Ruth's words echoed his blessing closely enough that he could hear his own theology returned as a call to act. He had recognized that she sought refuge under the Lord. She now asked whether his household would receive the woman whose faith he had praised. Everything depended on the distinction between ability and willingness. Boaz had the means to protect. He had already demonstrated authority, wealth, and generosity. He had some standing as a redeemer, but no amount of ability could settle the matter without a decision. That decision carried cost. Redemption involved property, obligation to the dead, responsibility for Naomi's family, and marriage to a Moabite widow. Accepting Ruth meant accepting the history that had brought her to his feet. Rejecting her would also have consequences. Ruth would remain a widow after the harvest. Naomi's household would still lack an heir. The family connection Boaz possessed would remain unused, while the line of Elimelech moved closer to extinction. Ruth had brought all of this into a single request. Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Boaz was fully awake now. He knew who lay at his feet, why she had come, and what she was asking him to become. The next words belonged to him. Boaz answered with a blessing. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. His first words removed the immediate danger from the encounter. He did not accuse Ruth, rebuke her, or treat her presence as an attempt to dishonor him. He received her appeal as an act worthy of blessing. You have shown more kindness now than you did before, he continued, because you have not gone after younger men, whether poor or rich. The earlier kindness was Ruth's loyalty to Naomi after Mahlon's death. She had left her parents and country, entered an unfamiliar people, and worked to support her mother-in-law. Boaz had already praised that faithfulness in the field. Her later kindness was the choice she had just placed before him. Ruth could have pursued marriage solely as a means of securing her own future. A younger man might have appeared a more natural match, whether he possessed wealth or had little. Instead, Ruth sought a man within Elimelech's family who could act as redeemer. Her appeal therefore preserved the interests of the dead as well as the living. Ruth wanted rest, but she had chosen a path that could carry Mahlon's name and Elimelech's household forward. Boaz recognized that family loyalty as a greater continuation of what she had already done for Naomi. His reference to younger men also clarified the nature of Ruth's approach. She had not come to the threshing floor chasing wealth. Boaz included both poor and rich young men in the alternatives she had passed over. The decisive fact was not the size of his harvest. It was his place within the family. Boaz addressed her again. Now, my daughter, do not be afraid. Ruth's fear could have had several immediate grounds, and Boaz's promise answered all of them together. She was alone at night in a vulnerable position. Her future depended on his interpretation of her request. Her reputation could be damaged if the encounter were exposed without explanation. She had also asked him to assume obligations that reached into marriage, inheritance, and the survival of a household. Boaz gave her security before giving her the whole answer. I will do for you all that you ask. The statement was direct. Boaz accepted the substance of Ruth's claim. He was willing to spread his protection over her and act as redeemer. He did not reduce his response to another measure of grain. Ruth had asked him to move beyond generosity at harvest, and he agreed. The man with power had chosen to use it on behalf of the widow at his feet. Then Boaz explained how Ruth was regarded in Bethlehem. All the people at the gate of my town know that you are a woman of worth. Ruth had entered Bethlehem as a foreigner whose future depended on finding favor. By the end of harvest, her character was publicly known. The town gate represented more than an entrance through the wall. It was where elders gathered, transactions were witnessed, disputes were heard, and community judgments took shape. To say that the people at the gate knew Ruth's worth meant that her reputation extended among those whose recognition mattered in public life. Her nighttime appeal did not create her character. It tested the character already established through months of visible loyalty and work. The description also placed Ruth beside Boaz in a revealing way. Boaz had entered the account as a man of substantial standing. He now called Ruth a woman of worth. He possessed land and public authority. She had arrived with neither, yet the same quality of strength, ability, and honorable character could be recognized in both. This public reputation would matter if the family claim moved beyond the threshing floor. Redemption, involving land and household continuity, could not remain a secret agreement between two people. It would require the town's structures and witnesses. Ruth would enter that public process as a woman whose conduct was already respected. Boaz's willingness appeared to settle the matter. Then he revealed an obstacle. "It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." Naomi had identified Boaz as one of their redeemers. She had been exact. He belonged near enough to act. But another man stood closer in the family order. That nearness carried priority. The responsibilities and rights of redemption did not pass to whichever relative first wished to take them. The closest eligible kinsman had the first opportunity. Boaz could not honor the family's customs by ignoring the man whose claim came before his own. The discovery changed Ruth's position in an instant. She had approached the man Naomi named, and he had accepted her appeal. But Boaz's willingness was now conditional on another relative's decision. A man Ruth had not addressed, and whose character had not yet entered the story, possessed the first right to determine her future. Boaz knew this before Ruth came to the threshing floor. His knowledge explains the care in his answer. He did not promise an immediate marriage that he lacked the legal freedom to complete. He separated desire from right. The nearer redeemer would have to be confronted with the full claim. If he accepted, Boaz would yield. If he refused, the right and obligation could pass to Boaz. That was the cost of acting honorably within the family. Boaz could not use a private encounter to seize a result the public order had not awarded him. Ruth's appeal gave him a reason to act, but kinship determined how he must proceed. He laid out the alternatives. "Remain tonight. In the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you." The first possibility was not the one Ruth had requested, but Boaz treated it as legitimate. If the nearer man fulfilled the obligation, the family would be preserved through him. Boaz's commitment was to redemption itself before it was to his own place in the outcome. That response confirms his understanding of Ruth's appeal. The issue was not a private romance to be protected from a rival. It was the restoration of a family through the relative who held the proper right. Boaz was ready to act, but he would not turn faithfulness into possession. The second possibility carried his personal pledge. If the nearer man refused, Boaz would redeem. He strengthened the promise with an oath. "As the Lord lives." Boaz had invoked the Lord when blessing his workers, when praying for Ruth's reward, and when blessing her at his feet. Now he invoked God's living reality as the guarantee of his own future action. Ruth no longer depended on a vague expression of goodwill. Boaz committed himself to a clear sequence. The nearer relative would receive his rightful opportunity. If that man declined, Boaz would take responsibility. This promise gave Ruth an answer without giving her an outcome. She knew Boaz was willing. She also knew that willingness might never become marriage if the nearer relative accepted. The identity of her redeemer remained unresolved. The new obstacle carried its own danger because legal priority and moral character were not the same. The nearer man's right came from family position. Ruth had not worked in his field, received his protection, or heard him bless her loyalty. Yet the customs of redemption gave him the first decision. Boaz did not try to shape Ruth's opinion of him. He did not criticize the nearer man or imply that refusal was certain. He presented the claim honestly. If he will redeem, let him redeem. That honesty protected the legitimacy of whatever happened next. A household restored through hidden circumvention would begin under dispute. Boaz intended to bring the matter into proper order. For the remainder of the night, however, Ruth still required protection. Boaz told her, "Lie down until morning." Sending her away in darkness would expose her on the road and increase the likelihood of discovery. Remaining at his feet kept her in the place where he could guard both her safety and the integrity of the encounter. His instruction also established restraint. He had agreed to Ruth's request, but the unresolved right of the nearer Redeemer prevented him from treating the agreement as complete. He would settle the claim before acting as husband. The darkness that allowed Ruth to approach privately now became a period of waiting. She had done everything within her power. She had followed Naomi's plan, identified herself, stated the claim, and received Boaz's promise. The next action belonged to men operating in the public life of Bethlehem. For Ruth, that meant surrendering control again. On the road from Moab, she had made the decisive choice. In the field, her labor had converted opportunity into food. At the threshing floor, her words had called a redeemer to act. Now her future rested first with an unnamed relative, and then with Boaz's oath. Still, the situation was no longer what it had been when she entered the threshing floor. Ruth had arrived, without knowing whether Boaz would receive her request. She now knew that he considered her worthy, understood her loyalty, and desired to do all she had asked. The obstacle did not arise from rejection. It arose from a prior claim. Boaz had answered Ruth's courage with his own responsibility. He would not evade the closer Redeemer, and he would not abandon Ruth if that man refused. Ruth remained at his feet through the remaining darkness. Above them stood the God by whose life Boaz had sworn. Around them lay the grain of a completed harvest. Ahead waited the public decision that neither could make on the threshing floor. Morning would place Ruth's future in another man's hands. Before dawn, Ruth rose. The light was not yet strong enough for one person to recognize another. Boaz had kept her safely at his feet through the night, but he did not allow the encounter to become public when workers began returning to the threshing floor. He said, "It must not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." The instruction protected Ruth's name as well as his own. The truth of the encounter rested in the words they had exchanged. Ruth had made a family appeal, and Boaz had agreed to pursue redemption in its proper order. Anyone who saw only a woman leaving his sleeping place could attach a different meaning to the scene before either of them had an opportunity to explain. Public misunderstanding could damage the very resolution they sought. Ruth's recognized worth mattered to the family claim. Boaz's standing mattered to his ability to handle it at the town gate. Secrecy at this stage did not conceal a completed arrangement. It preserved both reputations until the legal question could be settled openly. Boaz then said, "Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out." Ruth held it out. He measured 6 portions of barley and placed the grain upon her. The gift was substantial enough to require the garment as a carrying cloth. Ruth had come to the threshing floor without a harvest load. She left bearing grain supplied directly by its owner. This was different from her first day of gleaning. Then Boaz instructed workers to pull stalks from the bundles while Ruth gathered and processed them. Now the grain had already passed through harvest, threshing, and winnowing. Boaz measured it himself and placed it in her hands. The barley served several purposes at once. It gave Ruth something visible to carry back to Naomi. The private promise at the threshing floor could not yet be announced to Bethlehem, but Naomi would receive evidence that Boaz had welcomed the appeal and had not sent Ruth away in disgrace. It also extended his provision beyond the completed harvest. Ruth's regular access to the fields had ended when barley and wheat were gathered. Boaz now supplied grain from the finished yield, confirming that his concern for the two widows would not vanish with the gleaning season. The gift did not purchase Ruth's silence or settle the redemption. Boaz's oath had done neither. Another relative still possessed the first right, and the outcome remained undetermined. The barley accompanied a promise that had to be tested in public. Ruth left before the growing light could reveal her. The same town she had entered openly beside Naomi now had to be crossed with care. Her public reputation had been built through visible loyalty. The night's necessary secrecy protected that reputation rather than replacing it. She returned to her mother-in-law. Naomi met her with a question. "How did it go, my daughter?" The words asked more than whether Ruth had completed the instructions. Naomi wanted to know what the encounter had made her. Had Boaz received the appeal? Had he accepted responsibility? Was Ruth still only a widow seeking rest, or had the night established a new future for her? Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done. The report carried Naomi into the encounter she had designed but not witnessed. Ruth explained that Boaz had received her with blessing, praised her loyalty, and affirmed that Bethlehem knew her as a woman of worth. She told Naomi that he was willing to act as redeemer. Then she revealed the obstacle. There was a relative nearer than Boaz. That information changed Naomi's plan. She had selected Boaz because he belonged to the family and had shown reliable character. Now she learned that family order gave another man the first opportunity. Ruth also reported Boaz's pledge. He would bring the matter to its proper decision. If the nearer man accepted redemption, that claim would stand. If he refused, Boaz had sworn by the living Lord that he himself would redeem. The uncertainty was real, but it was contained within a promise. Ruth had not returned with an evasive answer or a request for more time. Boaz had defined what would happen next and committed himself to act. Then Ruth explained the barley. "He gave me these 6 portions, for he said, 'You must not return empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Boaz had directed the gift toward Naomi. That explanation gave the grain a meaning larger than hospitality toward Ruth. Boaz knew that Ruth's request involved the older widow waiting at home. Redemption concerned Naomi's household, and his provision acknowledged her directly. The word empty reached back to Naomi's arrival in Bethlehem. She had told the women of the town, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." At that moment, emptiness named the absence of her husband and sons, the collapse of the family's future, and the poverty with which she returned. Boaz did not pretend that barley could replace the dead, but he refused to let Ruth return to Naomi with nothing. The grain therefore became a sign of movement within Naomi's loss. She had arrived without a harvest, and Ruth had filled their food supply through gleaning. She had arrived believing the family line had ended, and Ruth now brought word that a redeemer had accepted responsibility, though another claimant had to decide first. Emptiness was beginning to lose its finality. The 6 portions did not reveal which man would become redeemer. They revealed that Naomi's household had entered the active concern of a man determined to settle the matter. Boaz had placed part of his abundance into Ruth's cloak and sent it to the woman who once believed divine kindness had abandoned both living and dead. Naomi listened to the full account and recognized the kind of man Ruth had encountered. "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out." The instruction reversed the pattern of the previous night. Naomi had told Ruth when to wash, where to go, what to watch, and how to approach. Ruth had acted at every stage. Now Naomi told her to stop. Nothing more was required from Ruth. She had made the claim plainly and obtained Boaz's commitment. Approaching the nearer relative herself would not strengthen the case. The next stage belonged at the gate, where men of the family and elders of Bethlehem could witness the decision. Waiting did not mean uncertainty without direction. Naomi understood that Boaz had accepted the burden of action. "The man will not rest," she said, "until he has settled the matter today." Naomi based that confidence on everything Ruth reported. Boaz had not taken advantage of the private setting. He had named the nearer relative when concealment would have served his own interests. He had bound himself by oath, protected Ruth's reputation, and sent provision for Naomi before morning. A man who acted with that precision would not allow the claim to drift. The rest Naomi sought for Ruth had now produced restlessness in Boaz. Ruth was told to wait because he would not. The word matter covered a complex set of responsibilities. The nearer redeemer's right had to be presented. Elimelech's family property had to be considered. Ruth's place as Mahlon's widow had to be joined to the preservation of the dead man's name. Witnesses had to hear whatever choice was made. None of that could be resolved by affection or by the promise of one man alone. The family's future required a public decision with lasting force. Ruth and Naomi therefore remained at home with the barley between them. Their positions had changed since the previous evening. Naomi no longer needed to devise another approach. Ruth no longer had to wonder whether Boaz would regard her appeal as shameful. Both knew that he was willing to redeem. They also knew that willingness might not decide the outcome. Somewhere in Bethlehem was a man whose closeness to Elimelech gave him priority over Boaz. He had not heard Ruth's request. He had not seen the grain delivered to Naomi. He had made no promise. By ordinary family order, his answer had to come first. Ruth could not influence when he appeared or what he valued. Naomi could not transfer his right to Boaz by preference. Boaz alone was positioned to bring him before witnesses and reveal the full responsibility attached to redemption. Naomi's final counsel held Ruth inside that limit. Wait. The command asked Ruth to trust the character she had already tested. Boaz had protected her in the field, at the meal, through the night, and at dawn. He had now promised to protect the integrity of the family claim. The darkness had lifted over Bethlehem, and the day of decision had begun. Ruth remained with Naomi. Boaz would not rest until the matter was settled. Boaz went to the town gate and sat down. The gate was the correct place to turn a private promise into a binding public act. People passed through it on their way to fields, markets, homes, and neighboring settlements. Elders gathered there to hear disputes and witness transactions. A matter settled at the gate entered the memory of the community. Boaz did not have to search long. The nearer redeemer passed by. Boaz called to him, "Come over here, friend, and sit down." The man turned aside and sat. He enters the scene through his family position rather than his personal name. For the decision ahead, the crucial fact was that he stood closer to Elimelech than Boaz did. He possessed the first right to redeem and therefore the first responsibility to answer. Boaz then gathered 10 men from the elders of the town. "Sit down here," he told them. They sat. The number created a formal body of witnesses large enough to confirm what was said and done. Boaz was not seeking a private agreement that the nearer man might later deny. He assembled respected representatives of Bethlehem before presenting the claim. The arrangement also protected every person involved. The Redeemer would make his choice openly. Boaz's conduct could be examined. Naomi's property interests would be acknowledged. Ruth's future would not be determined by an unwitnessed promise at the threshing floor. Once the men were seated, Boaz addressed the nearer relative. "Naomi, who has returned from the country of Moab, is transferring the portion of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." The property brought Elimelech's household into the gate, even though Elimelech himself was dead. Naomi's return had reactivated the family's connection to land in Bethlehem. But as a widow without sons, she could not restore its future by herself. The field was a family inheritance rather than an isolated commercial asset. It represented Elimelech's place within the clan and the means by which his household could remain rooted in Bethlehem. If economic need forced Naomi to transfer control of it, the closest relative had the opportunity to keep that control within the family. Boaz explained why he had summoned the man. "I thought I should inform you, acquire it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people." The nearer Redeemer received the offer before witnesses. Boaz did not approach the land himself and then ask the community to approve what he had already done. He honored the family order he had revealed to Ruth. "If you will redeem it, Boaz said. "But if you will not redeem it, tell me, so that I may know." The choice was direct. The nearer man could accept the responsibility and right, or he could decline and allow it to pass. "There is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." Boaz publicly placed himself second. Those words cost him control of the outcome. He had sworn that he would redeem if the nearer man refused, but he had also told Ruth that acceptance by the nearer man would stand. Now the elders heard him submit to that order. The man answered, "I will redeem it." The first decision closed the path Boaz hoped might open. From the nearer man's perspective, the offer concerned family land. Redemption would allow him to acquire the property interest while preventing Elimelech's field from passing outside the clan. He possessed the resources or confidence to accept, and he did so without hesitation. The answer also appeared to resolve Ruth's future before her name had been spoken. Boaz had promised to yield if the closer relative redeemed. Ruth waited with Naomi elsewhere in Bethlehem. Neither woman stood at the gate to shape the response. The man with priority had said yes. But Boaz had not yet presented the complete obligation. He continued, "On the day you acquire the field from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, in order to preserve the dead man's name with his inheritance." Ruth now entered the legal discussion in full. Boaz identified her origin, her widowhood, and her relationship to the dead. She was Ruth the Moabite, the woman who had come from outside Israel. She was also the widow whose marriage to Mahlon connected her to Elimelech's household. The field and the widow could not be separated without defeating the purpose of redemption. If the nearer man took control of Elimelech's land solely to enlarge his own estate, the property might remain technically within the wider clan, while the dead man's household disappeared. No descendant would carry Mahlon's name in connection with that inheritance. Ruth's inclusion changed the objective. Redemption now meant preserving a family rather than merely recovering a field. The man who accepted would take responsibility for Ruth in marriage. A child born from that union could continue the name of the dead and inherit the property associated with Elimelech's household. The Redeemer's resources would secure land whose future belonged to that restored line. That obligation gave Ruth a central role in the transaction without making the land her only significance. Her marriage could create the descendant through whom property, name, and household were joined again. Boaz had understood this at the threshing floor. Ruth asked him to spread his wing over her because he was a redeemer. She was calling him to accept the whole threatened family. At the gate, Boaz made certain that the nearer man faced the same complete claim. The order of presentation allowed the elders to hear the man's willingness toward the property before hearing his willingness toward the family burden attached to it. His first answer established that he wanted to redeem when redemption appeared to involve land alone. Now he had to decide whether he wanted Elimelech's inheritance preserved for Elimelech's line. The nearer Redeemer answered again, "I cannot redeem it for myself, or I may endanger my own inheritance." The additional obligation reversed his decision. He had been willing to commit resources when the land could strengthen his estate. Marriage to Ruth and the requirement to preserve the dead man's name changed the economic result. The redeemed property would not simply merge into his household for the unrestricted benefit of his existing heirs. It would be connected to a descendant representing the family of Mahlon and Elimelech. That could diminish what passed through the Redeemer's own line. He would bear present cost and responsibility while creating a future claim that limited the gain. By his own judgment, accepting the full redemption threatened the inheritance he already possessed. His refusal was therefore carefully framed around his household. The story does not present him as unable to acquire the land. He had just agreed to do so. He declared himself unable to redeem for myself once redemption required him to serve another family's continuity. The difference exposed the moral weight of the role. A redeemer's action could require spending strength so that another name survived. Kinship duty was valuable precisely because the vulnerable household could not repay the intervention on ordinary commercial terms. Boaz had already shown willingness to accept that cost. He offered Ruth no private arrangement that detached her from Mahlon's name. At the gate, he insisted that whoever redeemed must preserve the dead man's place upon his inheritance. The nearer man would not. He turned the opportunity back to Boaz. "Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." The words released the claim the man had held ahead of Boaz. He acknowledged that the right could pass to the next relative and invited Boaz to exercise it. Everything Naomi and Ruth could not control had now been decided. The nearer man had appeared. He had received the offer in the presence of elders. He had accepted the land, learned the full obligation, and withdrawn because of the danger to his inheritance. His refusal did not yet complete the transfer. The relinquishment still had to be confirmed according to the recognized custom, and Boaz still had to declare publicly what he would acquire. But the obstacle revealed at the threshing floor had moved out of the way. The man with the first claim faced the elders and repeated his decision. "I cannot redeem it." A recognized custom now completed the nearer man's refusal. In earlier times in Israel, when a right of redemption or exchange was transferred, one man removed his sandal and gave it to the other. The act served as visible confirmation. Before witnesses, something that could be remembered and described had passed from one man to another. The nearer redeemer removed his sandal. He gave it to Boaz and said, "Acquire it for yourself." The right was now relinquished in a form the elders recognized. The man who stood first in the family order had declined the full obligation and transferred his opportunity to the man who stood after him. Boaz turned to the elders and everyone present at the gate. "You are witnesses today that I have acquired from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech and everything that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon." His declaration gathered the property of the dead household under public redemption. The land would remain connected to the family from which famine and death had nearly separated it. Then Boaz named Ruth. "I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, as my wife, in order to preserve the name of the dead with his inheritance." Ruth's identity was spoken openly before Bethlehem's elders. She remained Ruth the Moabite, but that origin did not disqualify her from the witnessed commitment Boaz now made. Her marriage to Mahlon had joined her to the dead man's household. Her marriage to Boaz would preserve that household's future. Boaz stated the purpose plainly. Mahlon's name was not to disappear from among his relatives or from the gate of his town. The man who had died in Moab would retain a place in Bethlehem through the family created after him. Land, name, and descendant would be joined again. The promise at the threshing floor had reached its public fulfillment. Ruth had asked Boaz to spread his wing over her because he was a redeemer. He had answered that another man stood nearer. Now that man's refusal was complete, the sandal had passed, and Boaz accepted every responsibility before the elders. He did not acquire the field while avoiding Ruth. He did not take Ruth while detaching her from Mahlon's inheritance. He accepted the entire burden as one act of redemption. Boaz finished, "You are witnesses today." The elders and all the people at the gate answered, "We are witnesses." The matter no longer rested on a conversation known only to Ruth and Boaz. Bethlehem's public memory now held the agreement. The people who had once stirred at the sight of Naomi returning empty stood witness to the restoration of her household. Then they blessed Ruth and Boaz. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel." Rachel and Leah stood among the ancestral mothers of Israel's tribes. The blessing asked that Ruth entering Boaz's house receive a fruitful place within that same people. The words answered Ruth's pledge on the road from Moab. She had said that Naomi's people would become her people. At the gate of Bethlehem, those people invoked Israel's mothers when welcoming her into Boaz's household. The witnesses continued, "May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." Boaz already possessed standing in the town. Now his name was joined to a redemption that preserved the inheritance of another man. The elders asked that the household formed through that action flourish, where Elimelech's line had nearly ended. Their final blessing reached into Bethlehem's own ancestry. "May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman." Perez belonged to the line from which the families of Bethlehem traced their descent. His birth also arose from a threatened family line preserved through the determined action of a widow. By naming him, the witnesses placed Ruth's future within a remembered pattern of family continuity emerging from danger. The blessing did not guarantee a child through custom alone. The elders asked the Lord to give offspring. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. The union was no secret arrangement following the night at the threshing floor. It came after the nearer relative had been heard, the elders had witnessed the transfer, and Boaz had publicly declared his responsibility toward Ruth and the dead. Boaz went into her, and the Lord gave her conception. Ruth bore a son. The birth resolved what neither migration nor remarriage in Moab had produced. Elimelech's household again possessed a future generation. Naomi, who had returned without husband, sons, or grandson, now lived to see a child born through Ruth. The women of Bethlehem came to Naomi. At her arrival they had asked, "Is this Naomi?" and listened while she renamed herself through bitterness. Now they spoke again, interpreting what had happened within the same community that had witnessed her loss. "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you today without a redeemer." Their blessing directed Naomi's attention toward the God whose hand she once believed had brought her home empty. The child now represented continuing family life, someone through whom the household could endure. May his name be renowned in Israel. The women looked beyond the infant's immediate comfort to the name he might carry among the people. Their words would receive an answer far greater than Bethlehem could yet see. They continued, speaking to Naomi. "He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you has borne him." The child would give Naomi a living connection to the future. He could become support in the years when age increased her dependence. His birth placed a descendant where death had left none. Then the women described Ruth's value with the strongest family comparison available to them. "She is better to you than 7 sons. 7 represented fullness. Sons were ordinarily regarded as a widow's strength, providers and carriers of family continuity. Naomi had lost 2 sons and believed that loss defined her emptiness. The women now declared that Ruth's loyalty had accomplished what an ideal fullness of sons might have been expected to secure. Ruth had clung to Naomi when Naomi could offer her no husband. She had left Moab, gleaned through the harvest, approached Boaz as redeemer, and borne the child through whom Naomi's household was restored. Naomi took the infant into her arms and held him close. The woman who had asked Bethlehem to call her bitter now held the living consequence of Ruth's refusal to abandon her. The child did not erase Elimelech, Mahlon, or Kilion. He carried their household forward from the place where their deaths had seemed final. Naomi became his nurse and caregiver. The women of the neighborhood gave the child his name. "A son has been born to Naomi," they said. Biologically, Ruth had borne him. Within the restored household, his birth answered Naomi's loss so directly that Bethlehem spoke of him as her son. They named him Obed. The name is associated with serving. The child would serve as Naomi's restorer and sustain the family's future. But his place would extend beyond the household gathered around him. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David. The genealogy at the end of Ruth traces the line with deliberate brevity. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. The child placed in Naomi's arms became the grandfather of Israel's most celebrated king. David would be identified with Bethlehem, the same town famine had forced Elimelech to leave. The royal line did not emerge around Ruth by accident or by hiding her origin. It passed directly through the son born to the Moabite widow, whom Bethlehem received through redemption. Generations later, Matthew's genealogy would name her explicitly within the ancestry leading through David and the kings to Jesus. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. The genealogical formula could have moved from Boaz to Obed without preserving the mother's name. Instead, Ruth remains visible. The foreign widow who once followed the reapers now stands within the written line of the king. And at the beginning of that royal branch is a small household in Bethlehem, Ruth with her newborn son and Naomi holding Obed against her breast.